I had a client who was 7 years into retirement, and she had pulled up her account balance one day, and she was, expecting to see a number that had slowly been going down. But instead, she saw a number that was higher than when she had actually retired. And so she called her husband in. They both looked at it, and then she gave me a call. And, she was asking me, she said, are we doing something wrong? Are we not spending enough? Should we be enjoying this more? And of course, they weren't doing anything wrong. That the math here was just working in a way that nobody had really explained to her. So Janet and Greg had retired, and he was 63, she was 64. They had about $1.85 million saved. And about 7 years later, they had about $2.1 million. Now, that's not necessarily all that unusual, and I'll explain why. It happens because of the math that most people just never really see before they retire. And by the way, if we haven't met yet, my name's Ryan Kravitz. I'm a certified financial planner professional, and I help people transition into and through retirement. So why does this happen? Well, it's not just one thing. It really comes down to three separate things that all work together. And the thing is that I find anyways, is that most people have never seen all three of them at the same time. So I want to go through these one by one. The first is the income replacement gap, I call it, and then the spending curve, and then the portfolio math. And so let's talk here about the income replacement gap first. So I'm willing to bet that you have probably heard that, once you retire, you need to have 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. I mean, every few months or so, I feel like I see different articles and things in magazines and stuff like that. And it'll say that, something to the effect, you need 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. I don't know where this idea came from, but I can tell you, I truly believe that rule does more harm than good. And the reason why is that it's not about your income. It's all about what your spending is. That's really the place where you need to start. And the reason this is the case is because, think about this for a second. When you're working, you have additional expenses that you don't have when you're retired. So, for instance, for one, you're actually saving for retirement, right? So those contributions to your 401k or whatever else you're saving while you're working, those go away. So maybe that was 15% or so of your paycheck. And then you've got payroll taxes, right? That's, FICA, that's 7.65%. And so that's gone when you retire, because those payroll taxes or FICA, that's only when you're working, right? It's unearned income only. And so again, in retirement, you don't have to worry about that. And then also you've got work-related spending, right? Like commuting costs, especially if you drive a long way to work. I mean, those costs can add up with gas and also the wear and tear on the car and everything else. And then you've got work clothes you have to buy. And then a lot of times you're going on lunches out and things like that. And, so for a lot of people, that can add up to be about another 5 to 8% of income. So of course it varies, but it's just kind of rough guidelines. But all those expenses, those are out the window. So let's get back to Janet and Greg. So for them, they made about $175,000. So if you do that math, that's 70 to 80% of pre-retirement income, like a lot of sources out there will say that you need. Well, that means that they would need $125,000 to $140,000 in retirement. But for Janet and Greg, they didn't need or really even want nearly that much. They weren't big spenders. And so for them, when we actually looked at what they really wanted retirement to look like, what are the things they really wanted to be able to do, and really mapped out what their spending was and things, the real number was much closer to about 95,000. I mean, much lower, than 125 to 140,000. And so, again, they only needed and wanted 95,000, and their Social Security alone, well, that covered about 55,000. And so for them, they only needed to withdraw about $40,000 a year from their portfolio. I mean, they were in really good shape. And if you do the math on that, $40,000 on $1.85 million portfolio, that's only about a 2.2% withdrawal rate. That's really low. And at that rate, they could absolutely spend more. They just didn't want to. They lived simply. I mean, they were happy. I mean, they got to do all the things that they wanted to be able to do. And the fact is that at 2.2%, you're likely not drawing down the portfolio, at least not in most markets. And in most markets, you're going to see that it's going to grow. And that leads right into the second piece here, because even that 95,000 that they had projected to be the number that's going to give them the lifestyle that they want to have, their actual spending still came in below that pretty consistently. And there's a reason for that, quite frankly. The thing is that a lot of times when retirement plans get built, you look at it and say, okay, we're going to look at this over the course of maybe a 30-year time frame, and we're going to adjust the spending needs for inflation by maybe 2% or 3% or something like that. And in the real world, though, with most people, that's not what happens. Typically, what happens is, those early years of retirement. You probably have heard of the go-go years of retirement, right? You're now retired, and now's the opportunity when you're the youngest you're ever going to be again, right? And likely the healthiest and likely having the most energy. And now you have the time and freedom and all of that to be able to do the things that maybe on your bucket list, things you want to be able to do. A lot of times things that come up are like, big travel, type of things, like, that big trip to year that you want to go for a few weeks that, while you're working, maybe you actually had the vacation time, but you weren't comfortable actually taking that much vacation, or maybe you weren't allowed to take that much vacation at a time. And so you actually couldn't do it, whatever it is, but now's your opportunity to be able to do all these things. So a lot of times there is a lot more spending in those earlier years, but then it starts to scale back. Those middle years, spending starts to decline more. And then in the later years, healthcare costs can go up a bit, but overall spending is still usually below what people had actually projected way back when they had first retired. Every year that you spend less than your plan had originally assumed, well, that's money that just continues to stay in the portfolio. And so in Janet and Greg's case, their first 3 years of retirement, they pretty much spent what they had expected to spend. But, something interesting happened, like I do see happen to a lot of retirees, is that in years 4 through 7, they started to spend less. It was, about 10 to 12% each year, less than they had actually originally assumed that they were going to spend. And so, now you've got a situation where now you've got a lower starting withdrawal rate than most people expect, and then actual spending that keeps coming in under that projection. And so the third piece is really what ties all this together, and that's the portfolio math itself. Most people assume that because they're taking money out of the portfolio, especially over a longer period of time, that the portfolio is going to be going down. But that's not necessarily how it works, because it certainly depends how markets perform and all of that, and your withdrawal rate and all these things that we've talked about. So you take just a very simple example, on a $1.85 million portfolio, let's say it earns 6% in a year. Well, that's $111,000 in growth. And so, if you only need to withdraw or want to withdraw $50,000, well, the portfolio is still up $61,000. That's even while you're spending from it. Now the real risk here, of course, and we have to be, cognizant of that, we have to plan for it, or the potential of it, is that if markets were to drop hard, especially in year 1 or 2, because, then you could be selling shares at low prices before they have an opportunity in the future to potentially recover. And that's the scenario that actually can do real damage. That's sequence of returns risk. So got to have a plan for that. But in normal or in better types of markets, with a reasonable withdrawal rate, like especially 2.2%, which is very low, the math really tends to work in your favor. I mean, even if you look at the 4% rule as an example, that was built to hold up through the absolute worst, market periods in history. And in most scenarios, people ended up with more than they had started with. And in a lot of cases, quite a bit more than they had started with. It's really a worst case floor. It's really not a target. And in fact, oftentimes I find that the 4% rule is too conservative for a lot of folks. That gets beyond the scope of what I want to get into here. All right. So based on everything that I've talked about here today, here's what I actually suggest that you go ahead and do with all this. The very first thing is to start with what you actually spend, not your income. Then subtract what goes away in retirement. And I'm willing to bet that that number is probably going to look a lot lower than you think. And then the next step, once you have that number, is you want to go ahead and you don't want to inflate it for 30 years. You know, if you retire, let's say at 65, thinking I need to have this money till 95, so I need to adjust this for inflation. No. Instead, think about where spending is likely to be high and then where it naturally comes down. And then figure out what your actual withdrawal rate is. You know, are you really at risk, or is the math actually working in your favor, like with Janet and Greg, you know, without you actually even realizing it? And, you know, if you get into retirement and you're spending less than you thought you would, just keep in mind that that's not necessarily a problem. It's only a problem if you could afford to spend more and you would like to spend more, but you're just not comfortable going ahead and doing that. You know, going back with Janet and Greg, they were super happy in retirement. They were able to do all the things that they wanted to do. They just didn't have lavish plans to spend lots and lots of money. So for them, they were more than happy. But again, everyone's situation is going to be different. Hope you found this helpful. If you'd like to take a look and learn more about what it would be like for us to work together, you could go ahead and click on the link that's in the description. You can learn more there and you could schedule a call. I want to thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.